Neighbors laughed at her cabin with no windows. Einar Halverson, who had survived 12 Nebraska winters, told her plainly, "A house without windows is a grave with a door. Those children will die in the hole you built them." She had $9, 3 children, and needed glass she couldn't afford. On May 3rd, 1884, hailstones like fists fell for 11 minutes. But 7 months earlier, Greta Lindqvist had never laid a single sod brick in her life. The wagon wheel cracked on the third day out of Blue Earth County. Greta heard it, a sound like a rifle shot, and pulled the ox to a stop. The crack ran through the iron rim and into the wood beneath. One more hard rut would split the wheel entirely, and then they'd be stranded on the open prairie with $47, 3 children, and nothing else. Carl, 6 years old, climbed down to look. "Can we fix it, Mama?" No, they couldn't fix it. Eric could have fixed it. Eric could have done a lot of things. But Eric was in the ground back in Minnesota, dead of typhoid 3 months now, and Greta was alone with his children and his dream and a cracked wagon wheel 200 miles from anywhere. She wrapped the crack with rope and canvas. She drove slower. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. The wheel held. Fillmore County, Nebraska, appeared on the horizon on September 23rd, 1883, as a line of nothing stretching in every direction. No trees, no hills, no buildings she could see. Just grass, brown and gold in the autumn light, rolling like frozen waves toward an endless sky. Somewhere in that emptiness was 160 acres that belonged to her now. Eric had filed the claim before he died. He'd walked this land, chosen this spot, imagined the house they'd build, and the crops they'd grow, and the life they'd make. He'd come back to Minnesota to fetch his family. The fever took him 11 days later. Greta found the claim marker in the late afternoon, a wooden stake with a number burned into it. She stood beside it and looked at what she'd inherited. Flat ground, tall grass, a small creek a quarter-mile north. Nothing else. Carl tugged her sleeve. "Where's the house?" There was no house. There was no barn. There was no well, no fence, no road. There was only the land and the sky and the wind that hadn't stopped blowing since they crossed into Nebraska. "We'll build one," Greta said. She had no idea how. The neighbor arrived on the third day. Greta saw him coming from a mile off, a dark shape on a horseback, growing larger against the grass. She gathered the children behind her and waited. She had a knife in her apron pocket. She didn't know what good it would do against a man on a horse, but it was all she had. The man was old, 50 at least, with a face like cracked leather and hands that looked like they'd been carved from oak. He wore a wool coat despite the mild weather, and he sat his horse like someone who'd spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it. "You the widow?" he asked. "I'm Greta Lindqvist. This is my claim." "I know what it is." He looked past her at the wagon, the ox, the 3 children watching from behind the wheel. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, something like pity or contempt or both. "Einar Halverson. I'm 3/4 of a mile east. Been here since 72. 12 years. He'd survived 12 Nebraska winters on this prairie. Greta tried to imagine what that meant and couldn't. "You know how to build a soddy?" Halverson asked. "No." "You got a grasshopper plow?" "No." "You got a man coming? Brother, cousin, anyone?" "No." Halverson was quiet for a moment. The wind filled the silence, bending the grass in waves that rolled across the land like something alive. "Mrs. Lindqvist," he said finally, "I've helped to build 14 sod houses in this county. I've seen settlers come and go. I've buried 6 of them myself when nobody else would do it." He pointed at her wagon. "You've got 1 ox. You've got 3 children too young to work. You've got maybe 8 weeks before the first hard freeze, and you don't have a roof over your head." I know. Do you? He shifted in his saddle, and for the first time, his voice had an edge to it. A proper soddy takes 3 weeks to build, and that's with help. You need 3,000 bricks. You need walls 2 feet thick. You need a roof that won't collapse when the snow piles up 4 feet deep. I'll learn. You'll die. The words came flat and final, like a door closing. A woman alone can't cut sod fast enough, not without a proper plow, not without a team, and even if you could. He stopped, shook his head. A house without windows is a grave with a door. You know what windows cost? Greta knew. She'd asked in Blue Earth before she left. A single window, sash, frame, glass, cost $12 to $15. She had $47 total. Enough for one window, maybe two, and then nothing left for food or fuel or seed. I can't afford windows, she said. Then you can't afford to live here. Halverson gathered his reins. Those children will go blind living in darkness, and when the fever comes, and it always comes, you'll watch them die in a hole you dug yourself. He turned his horse. Sell the claim. Go back to wherever you came from. Don't make me dig 4 more graves come spring. He rode away without looking back. Greta stood in the grass and watched him go. Behind her, Carl was crying. Anna, the baby, was coughing again, the same wet cough she'd had since they left Minnesota. Elin, 4 years old, just stared at the empty horizon with eyes that had already seen too much. $47. 3 children, 8 weeks until winter, and a neighbor who'd already written her obituary. The first week taught her what the word impossible actually meant. Sod bricks. That's what she needed. Bricks cut from the prairie itself, from the dense mat of grass roots that held the soil together. She'd seen pictures in a newspaper back in Blue Earth, drawings of sturdy houses made from the earth, warm in winter and cool in summer. It had looked simple enough. It wasn't simple. Without a grasshopper plow, Greta had to cut each brick by hand. She used a spade to slice through the roots and a hatchet to separate the blocks. Each brick was supposed to be 2 feet long, 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick. Her first attempts came out ragged and crumbling. She threw away more than she kept. A good brick weighed 50 pounds. By the end of the first day, she'd cut 12 usable bricks. 12. She needed 3,000. That night, lying in the wagon with her children, Greta did the math. 12 bricks a day. 3,000 needed. 250 days. She had 56. Her hands were already bleeding. Her back felt like someone had driven a spike through it. And she hadn't even started building yet. She'd only cut bricks. She still had to carry them, stack them, shape them into walls. The numbers didn't work. Halverson was right. A woman alone couldn't do this. But a woman alone with 3 children could not do it either. By the 3rd week, Greta had improved. Not enough, but some. She'd learned to cut when the ground was damp, too dry, and the bricks crumbled, too wet, and they weighed too much to lift. She'd learned to angle the spade to keep the root mass intact. She'd learned to score the grass side first so the bricks separated cleanly. 30 bricks a day now. Sometimes 35. Still not enough, but better. The east wall was half complete. The bricks lay in 2 rows, grass side down, stacked like oversized masonry. The wall was 30 inches thick, 2 bricks wide with a gap between them filled with loose grass for insulation. It looked sturdy. It looked like it might actually hold. But the wall was only 4 feet high and it needed to reach 7. And she had 3 more walls to build after this one. And the roof, and the door, and the windows. Greta stood in the half-built shell of what might become a house and stared at the gap where the window should go. Every soddy she'd seen had at least one window, a square of light in the dark wall, covered with oiled paper or greased cloth. or, if the family had money, actual glass. Light was essential. Halverson had said so. Every neighbor she'd met had said so. You couldn't live in darkness. You'd go mad. But she had $31 left now. She'd spent $16 on flour, salt, cornmeal, a small barrel of salt pork. She needed fuel for winter. Buffalo chips were free if she could gather enough, but coal cost money, and there wasn't enough buffalo dung on the whole prairie to heat a house for 5 months. $31. A window cost $12. If she bought even one window, she'd have $19 left for the entire winter. 5 months. 3 children. $19. The math didn't work that way either. Greta looked at the gap in her wall, looked at the endless sky beyond it, looked at her children sitting in the grass, Carl watching her with eyes that were too old for 6, Elin picking at the dirt with a stick, Anna coughing in her sleep. She thought about light. She thought about darkness. She thought about what Halverson had said. A house without windows is a grave with a door. Then she thought about something else. Windows broke. She'd seen it happen in Blue Earth, in a spring storm. Hailstones the size of marbles had cracked Mrs. Olson's front window, and the wind had come howling through, and the whole house had filled with rain and cold and chaos. Windows were holes in walls. Beautiful holes, yes. Necessary holes, everyone said, but holes nonetheless. What if she didn't make any holes? The idea came fully formed, like something that had been waiting in the back of her mind for permission to emerge. No windows, no glass, no gaps, no weak points, just 4 solid walls, 30 inches thick, with a single door on the south face and nothing else. It was the opposite of everything she'd been told. Halverson said windows were essential. Marta Henriksen, the neighbor's wife who'd stopped by with bread the week before, said a house without windows would drive you mad. Every drawing she'd seen, every description she'd read, every soddy she'd passed on the road from Minnesota had at least one window, but none of those soddies had been built by a woman alone with $31. Greta walked the perimeter of her half-built walls. She counted bricks. She calculated time. Without a window frame to build, without a glass pane to seat, without gaps to seal, she'd save a week of work, maybe more. A week she didn't have to spare, and the walls would be stronger. Every window was a joint, a seam, a place where the sod couldn't bond properly. Without windows, the walls would be continuous, solid. The wind would hit them and find nothing to exploit. The children would live in darkness. That was true. But they'd live. She picked up her spade. She filled in the gap where the window should have gone. Carl watched her do it. "Mama, where's the window going to be?" "There isn't going to be a window." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Like a cave?" "Like a cave that keeps you warm." It wasn't a good answer. She knew that, but it was the only answer she had. Marta Henriksen came on a Tuesday, carrying a basket with 3 eggs and a small pot of rendered lard. She was 34, mother of 4, wife of Anders Henriksen, who farmed a claim 1.5 miles to the south. She had kind eyes and rough hands, and a way of saying hard things that almost made them sound gentle. She stopped at the edge of the building site and stared. "Greta," she said slowly, "where are your windows?" "There aren't any." "I can see that." Marta walked around the walls, which were now 6 feet high on all sides. The door frame, salvaged boards from the wagon, stood on the south face, but everything else was solid sod. No gaps, no openings, just earth stacked on earth. You can't live in a house with no windows. I can't afford windows. You can't afford not to have them. Marta set down her basket and faced Greta directly. "I know you're trying to save money. I know you don't have much. But listen to me. I've lived on this prairie for 6 years. I've seen what winter does to people. The darkness, Greta. It eats at you. You wake up in the dark, and you work in the dark, and you go to sleep in the dark. And after a while, you forget what the sun looks like. Women have killed themselves over less. I know. Do you? Marta grabbed Greta's arm, not hard, but firm enough to make her stop. I had one window our first winter. One. Oiled paper over a wooden frame, maybe 18 inches square. And there were days I stood at that window for an hour, just looking at the light, because I thought I'd lose my mind if I couldn't see outside. You're talking about nothing, not even a flour sack over a hole. Just walls. The walls will keep my children alive. The walls will make you wish they hadn't. Marta let go, stepped back. Her voice softened. I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to help you. Even oiled paper, even a single pane the size of your hand would be better than this. You can't raise children in a dungeon. Greta bent to pick up another sawed brick. Her shoulders screamed. Her hands, wrapped in rags to protect the blisters, felt like they belonged to someone else. My children can't eat windows, she said. They can't burn windows to stay warm. If I spend $12 on glass, I won't have enough left to feed them past February. So you'll have money and dead children anyway because they went mad in the dark. Then I'll have mad children who are alive. Greta placed the brick, pressed it into position, didn't look up. I'll take that trade. Marta stood there for a long moment, basket in hand, eggs growing cold in the October wind. Then she set the basket on the ground and left without another word. The eggs were still warm when Greta fed them to the children that night. Thomas Lund arrived on horseback on the last day of October. Greta knew him by reputation before she knew him by face. He owned the general store in Shickley, 9 miles to the east, the only source of glass, lumber, nails, and hardware for 30 miles in any direction. Everyone who homesteaded in Fillmore County owed him money sooner or later. He sold goods on credit at 20% interest, and when the crops failed, and the crops always failed eventually, he collected. He'd bought 3 abandoned claims last year from families who couldn't pay. Rumors said he had his eye on several more. Lund was tall, thin, with a face that seemed to have been stretched over his skull too tightly. His smile never reached his eyes. Mrs. Lindqvist, he said, tipping his hat. I've heard a great deal about you. Have you? The whole county is talking about the Swedish widow building a windowless cabin. He looked at her walls, complete now, 7 feet high, solid as a small hill, and his smile widened. May I say, the rumors don't do it justice. I've never seen anything quite like it. What do you want? To help. He dismounted, still smiling. You've done remarkable work here, truly remarkable, but winter's coming, and I understand your situation is difficult. I'd like to offer you credit. Greta kept stacking sod on the roof frame. The willow branches bent under the weight but held. I don't need credit. Everyone needs credit eventually. Lund walked closer, picking his way over the scattered debris of construction. I can extend you $20 against next year's harvest. That's enough for 2 proper windows, a good door, and some nails. You can pay me back in wheat come August. And if the harvest fails, then we discuss other arrangements. His smile didn't change. I'm a reasonable man, Mrs. Lindqvist. I don't want to see anyone suffer. I simply want to see people set up for success. And this, he gestured at the windowless walls. This isn't success. This is desperation. Greta climbed down from the half-finished roof. Her back was a single continuous ache. Her hands were bleeding again through the rags. She faced Lund directly. I know what you want, she said. You want me in your debt. You want me struggling to pay you back so you can take my claim when I fail. You think I don't see it because I'm a woman, or because I'm foreign, or because I'm poor. Mrs. Lindqvist, this is my land. My husband died for this land. I will not hand it to you for the price of a window. Lund's smile flickered. For just a moment, something cold showed through the mask, something hard and calculating and patient. Then the smile returned. I understand, he said. Pride is a virtue, usually. He walked back to his horse. But when those children of yours get sick, and they will in that dark hole, you'll remember this conversation. You'll wish you'd taken the help when it was offered. He mounted up, looked down at her. I'll be here when you're ready, he said. I always am. He rode away toward Shickley, and Greta watched him go. $9 left, 3 children, 4 days to finish the roof before the first real snow, and a man in town who was already measuring her land for his own. The ox died on November 2nd. It happened fast. One moment the animal was pulling a load of willow branches back from the creek, 6 miles round trip, the same trip it had made 11 times before. The next moment it stumbled, its legs folded. It went down on its side and didn't get up. Greta dropped the guide rope and ran to it. The ox's eyes were open, glassy, already dimming. Its breath came in shallow gasps. She put her hand on its neck and felt the heartbeat stutter. Slow. Stop. Just like that. 40 pounds of meat she couldn't afford to lose and no way to butcher it properly. An animal that had pulled her wagon across 200 miles of prairie, that had helped her build walls that might save her children's lives, dead in the brown grass because she'd worked it too hard on too little food. Greta sat beside the body and cried. She hadn't cried when Eric died. She hadn't cried when she sold their house, their furniture, his tools. She hadn't cried during the journey, or when the wheel cracked, or when Halverson told her she was going to die. But now, sitting next to a dead ox under a gray November sky, she wept until her chest hurt. Carl found her there. He didn't say anything. Just sat down beside her and put his small hand on her arm. After a while, Greta wiped her face and stood up. We need to get what we can, she said. Help me with the knife. They took 40 pounds of meat. They left the rest for the coyotes. And then Greta carried the willow branches back herself. 2 trips, 4 hours each, while Carl watched his sisters in the unfinished house. 3 days later, she finished the roof. November 10th. The first real snow, 4 inches overnight, and the Lindqvist family slept inside their cabin for the first time. The walls were complete, 7 feet of solid sod, 30 inches thick, curving slightly inward at the top to help support the roof. The roof itself was willow branches covered with prairie hay, covered with sod bricks laid grass side up. The door was sod blocks wired to a wooden frame. So heavy, Greta had to use both hands to push it open, with a wooden bar that dropped into brackets on either side. No windows, no gaps, no light except what crept around the edges of the door. Inside, in the darkness, Greta's children huddled together on a raised platform bed made from the last of the wagon boards. Anna was coughing again. Carl was silent. Elin kept asking why it was dark. Because it's nighttime, Greta said. It's always nighttime in here, Elin said. Greta didn't answer. $7 left, salt pork running low, buffalo chips stacked against the wall, enough for maybe 3 weeks if she was careful. After that, she'd need to gather more, or buy coal, or burn twisted hay and hope the house didn't catch fire. She'd built the cabin. She'd beaten the deadline. She'd done what Halverson said was impossible, but winter hadn't truly arrived yet. Marta Henriksen came 2 days before Thanksgiving. She brought Anders and their 2 oldest sons, a team of horses, and a look on her face that was half guilt and half defiance. "I still think you're wrong about the windows," she said, "but no one deserves to freeze to death because they couldn't finish a roof." Greta stood in her doorway and stared at them. She didn't understand. "Anders noticed your ox didn't come back from the creek," Marta continued. We figured, well, we figured you might need help sealing things up before the real cold." Anders Henriksen, a big man with a quiet voice, was already examining the door frame. "Gaps here," he said. "Cold will come right through. You need to pack it with clay and grass." He looked at Greta. "You got any clay?" She shook her head. "I brought some." He jerked his thumb at the wagon. "Boys, get the bucket." They worked for 6 hours. Anders sealed the door frame with a clay and grass mixture that hardened like cement. His sons cut additional sod to reinforce a weak spot where two walls met. Marta helped Greta reorganize the interior, creating a small alcove for food storage that would stay naturally cool. When they were done, the cabin was tighter than Greta could have made it alone. The door fit snugly. The walls were solid. For the first time, it felt like shelter rather than desperation. "Thank you," Greta said. It wasn't enough. There were no words that would be enough. Marta pressed 3 jars of preserved tomatoes into her hands. "You come to us if you need anything, anything at all." She paused. "I still think you'll regret the windows, but you're braver than I am. I want you to know that." They left as the sun was setting. Greta watched them go, the wagon disappearing into the gray dusk, and she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Small and fragile and probably foolish. But there. December. January. February. The winter came in waves, each one worse than the last. Temperatures dropped to 18 below zero. Snow piled 3 feet deep against the north wall. The wind howled for days without stopping, driving ice crystals into every crack and crevice it could find. Inside the windowless cabin, the Lindqvist family survived. The 30-inch walls held the cold at bay. Even without a fire, the interior never dropped below freezing. With a small stove burning twisted hay and buffalo chips, they could keep the temperature near 50 degrees. Not warm, but survivable. The children wore every piece of clothing they owned. They slept together, all 4 of them, sharing body heat through the long nights. And the nights were long. That was the part Marta had warned about. In December, true darkness lasted 15 hours, and the cabin's darkness lasted all day. Greta lit a single grease lamp, rendered fat in a tin can with a twisted rag for a wick, and rationed it carefully. 2 hours of light in the evening, enough to cook, enough to see each other's faces. Then darkness again until morning, though morning inside the cabin looked exactly like night. Carl counted days by making scratches on the wall. Elin learned to recite prayers in the dark, her small voice filling the silence. Anna's cough came and went, worse in the cold, better when Greta fed her elderflower tea, then worse again when the tea ran out. In late January, a cold snap dropped temperatures to 22 below zero. Greta woke to find ice crystals forming on the inside of the door, the only place in the cabin where outside air could reach. She stuffed more grass into the gaps and spent the rest of the day huddled with her children under every blanket they owned. That night, Carl asked her if they were going to die. "No," Greta said. "We're not going to die." "Elin says we're in a grave." Greta pulled him closer. In the darkness, she couldn't see his face, but she could feel the fear in his small body. "Graves are for people who stopped fighting," she said. "We haven't stopped." He didn't say anything. After a while, his breathing slowed, and he was asleep. Greta lay awake until dawn. listening to the wind and wondering if she'd lied. In late February, Einar Halvorsen rode through the snow to check on the widow in the dungeon. He admitted later that he'd expected to find her dead. He found her thin, exhausted, and still alive. All three children were healthy. Anna's cough had improved since Christmas. Halvorsen stood in the doorway and looked at the interior, dark, cramped, smelling of smoke, and too many bodies in too small a space, and something shifted in his weathered face. "You made it," he said. "We're still making it. Winter's not over." "I know." He nodded slowly, looked at the walls, at the sealed door, at the complete absence of windows. "I told you a house without windows is a grave." "You did. Maybe I was wrong." The words seemed to cost him something. "Maybe graves have windows, and the dead just can't see through them." He left a sack of flour on her doorstep and rode away without another word. Greta fed her children flatbread that night and told them spring was coming. She almost believed it. March brought the first thaw. The snow began to melt. The temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in weeks. Greta opened her door and stood blinking in the sunlight, her eyes watering after months of darkness. Behind her, the children emerged one by one, pale as cave creatures, shielding their faces from a sun they'd almost forgotten existed. They'd made it. Against everything Halvorsen had said, everything Lund had predicted, everything Marta had feared, they'd made it through a Nebraska winter in a hole in the ground with no windows. Carl ran into the grass and shouted. Elin followed him, laughing. Anna toddled after them, still coughing but stronger than she'd been in months. Greta watched them and felt something loosen in her chest, something she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. They were alive. They were alive. But as she turned back to the cabin, she saw something on the western horizon. Clouds. Tall white clouds piling up against each other, building into towers. Spring on the Great Plains. She'd heard the stories. The time when winter and summer collided. The time when warm air and cold air fought for dominance. The time when the sky could turn violent without warning. Greta gathered her children and brought them inside. She closed the door, and she waited. April brought warmth that felt like mercy. The snow melted into the creek. The grass began to green. Greta walked her claim and found shoots pushing through the soil, the first signs of the prairie coming back to life after 5 months of death. She had work to do, planting. She'd bought seed in Shickley, $7 for enough wheat to cover 10 acres, the minimum required to prove up her claim. If the crop came in, she'd have money. Real money. Enough to buy food for next winter without rationing every bite. Carl helped her turn the soil with a borrowed plow. Anders Henriksen had lent it to her for a week, asking nothing in return except that she teach Marta the door sealing technique. The Henriksens' roof had leaked all winter. They wanted to rebuild before next year's storms. The children were outside now every day, their pale faces turning pink in the spring sun. Anna's cough had finally stopped. Elin had learned to identify prairie birds by their calls. Carl, 7 now, could cut sod bricks almost as fast as Greta could. They'd survived. Greta allowed herself to believe it, allowed herself to imagine the future, the crop coming in, the money accumulating, maybe a second room added to the cabin next year, maybe even a window if she could afford one, a small one, just enough light to read by. In Shickley, Thomas Lund watched the spring arrivals and updated his ledgers. 3 families had abandoned their claims over the winter. Their land would return to the government pool. He'd already filed the paperwork. Greta Lindqvist's name was not on his list. Not yet. Late April. The weather turned strange. One day would be warm, 65 degrees, sunshine, perfect for planting. The next would bring freezing rain and winds that bent the grass flat. The sky couldn't seem to decide what season it wanted to be. Greta knew what this meant. She'd heard the old-timers talk about it in Blue Earth, and she'd heard Halverson mention it when he came to check on her in February. Spring on the Great Plains was when the real storms came. Not the slow, grinding cold of winter, but the violent collisions of warm and cold air that spawned tornadoes, floods, and hail. Hail. The word made her think of windows. "Wait until the spring storms," Halverson had said. "Hail the size of eggs, wind that strips the roof off a proper house." She'd built her walls to survive winter. She hadn't thought much about what else they might have to survive. On April 28th, a thunderstorm rolled through the county. Lightning struck a barn 3 miles south and burned it to the ground. The rain came down so hard that the creek overflowed its banks and flooded the low ground near the Gruber place. Agnes Gruber. Greta had met her once, in February, when Agnes walked 2 miles through the snow to borrow salt. A bohemian widow, like Greta, husband dead, 1 child, barely surviving on a dugout claim east of the creek. Her English was worse than Greta's. Her situation was worse, too. The storm passed. The sun came out. The creek subsided, but the clouds kept building on the western horizon. Every afternoon, towers of white and gray piled up against each other, growing taller, darker, more ominous. The air felt heavy, charged, like something was waiting to happen. On the morning of May 3rd, 1884, the sky was clear, and the temperature was already 68 degrees by 10 o'clock. Greta propped open the cabin door to let in light and air. The children were outside, Carl checking the garden for sprouting wheat, Ellen and Anna playing in the grass. The world smelled like spring, like hope, like survival. She didn't see the clouds building in the west. Noon. The western horizon had changed. Where the sky had been blue, it was now a wall of darkness stretching from north to south, as far as Greta could see. The clouds weren't white anymore. They were gray, then purple, then a sickly green that made her stomach clench. The wind picked up, not the gentle spring breeze of the morning, but something harder, colder, carrying grit and the smell of rain. Greta called the children inside. "But it's not raining," Carl protested. "Inside, now." Something in her voice made him obey without another word. He gathered his sisters and herded them through the door. Greta followed, pulling the heavy sod door closed behind her, dropping the wooden bar into its brackets. The cabin went dark. Through the gap around the door frame, the only gap in the entire structure, she could see a sliver of the outside world. The grass was bending flat. The sky was turning the color of a bruise. "Mama?" Eileen's voice was small. "What's happening?" "A storm." "Like in winter?" "Different." Greta pulled the children to the center of the room, away from the walls. She didn't know why. Instinct. "Stay here, don't move." The first thunder rolled across the prairie like a wave, deep and long and building, then another, then a third, so loud the walls seemed to shake. And then the sound changed. It started as a hiss, a million tiny impacts, like sand thrown against stone. Greta thought it was rain, hard rain, the kind that came with spring storms. Then the hiss became a roar, not rain. Something heavier, something harder, something hitting the walls and roof with a violence that made the children scream. Hail. Greta had seen hail before. Small pellets, pea-sized, bouncing off roofs and grass like frozen rain. This wasn't that. This was something else entirely. Through the gap around the door, she could see white shapes falling, not pellets, but stones, chunks of ice the size of eggs, the size of her fist,
smashing into the ground hard enough to leave craters. The noise was unbearable. Each impact on the roof sent a shudder through the structure. Dust sifted down from the ceiling with every blow. The children were crying, all three of them, and Greta couldn't hear her own voice when she tried to comfort them. She wrapped her body around them, pulled them close, pressed them against the floor. The cabin shook. The walls absorbed blow after blow. 30 inches of sod and grass roots, packed solid, taking the punishment that would have shattered glass, splintered wood, torn through anything less substantial. Outside, she knew the world was being destroyed. The Halverson place was 3/4 of a mile east. 2 windows, purchased at considerable expense, faced west toward the approaching storm. The first hailstone to hit Halverson's window was the size of a hen's egg. It cracked the glass. The second one, moments later, was larger, nearly the size of a man's fist. It punched through the weakened pane and exploded into the room, sending shards of glass across the floor, where Halverson had been sitting moments before. He'd moved when he heard the hail start. Instinct. But now he stood in the middle of his cabin and watched in horror as the storm poured through the hole in his wall. Rain and ice and wind, finding the gap, exploiting it, turning his shelter into a sieve. The second window went 30 seconds later. Both holes now gaped like wounds, and the temperature inside the house dropped 20 degrees in a minute. Everything near the windows was instantly soaked. The wind drove rain across the room in horizontal sheets. Halverson grabbed blankets, tried to stuff them into the holes. The wind tore them away. He tried again, failed again, gave up, and retreated to the corner farthest from the windows, wrapping himself in what remained of his bedding, waiting for the storm to pass. His feet were already numb. A mile and a half south at the Henriksen place, Marta was screaming. Their window, the small oiled paper window she told Greta was essential for sanity, had been torn away in the first minute of the hailstorm. The wooden frame had splintered under a direct hit from a hailstone the size of a child's skull. The paper hadn't stood a chance, but that wasn't the worst of it. The roof. The sod roof, laid over willow branches and prairie hay, had taken too many direct hits. One section, the section directly over the children's sleeping area, had begun to sag, then to crack, then to collapse inward, dumping ice and mud and debris onto the beds below. Anders had pulled the children clear just in time. Now the family huddled in the corner while their house fell apart around them. The hole in the roof was growing. Hail was piling on the floor. The temperature was plummeting. "The barn!" Anders shouted over the roar. "We have to get to the barn! We can't go outside in this! We can't stay here!" They ran, 50 yards through a bombardment of ice, shielding the children with their bodies, feeling the impacts on their backs and shoulders like punches from a giant fist. They made it to the barn. The animals were screaming, but the barn had no windows, and its walls were holding. Marta thought of Greta Lindqvist in her windowless cabin. She thought she was right. In Shickley, 9 miles away, Thomas Loon watched his livelihood shatter. The general store had 6 windows facing west, 6 windows full of merchandise displays, glass panes, window frames, tools, dry goods. 6 windows that had cost him a small fortune to ship from Omaha. All 6 exploded in the first 2 minutes of the storm. The hail didn't just break the glass. It destroyed everything behind it. Window panes shattered by ice that then shattered the panes meant to replace them. A cascade of destruction, each broken piece adding to the chaos. Lund retreated to the back room and listened to his inventory being pulverized. $40 of glass, gone. $60 of other merchandise, water damaged beyond sale, gone. And somewhere out there, on a claim he'd wanted to buy,
A Swedish widow sat in a windowless cabin that wouldn't lose a single pane, because there were no panes to lose. 20 minutes into the storm, someone pounded on Greta's door. At first, she thought it was hail, another impact, louder than the rest. But then it came again, rhythmic, desperate, a human pattern. She lifted the bar. The wind nearly ripped the door from her hands. Ice and rain slashed at her face. On the threshold, Agnes Gruber, clutching her 3-year-old son, Jacob. Agnes was bleeding, a gash across her forehead, blood mixing with rain and running down her face. Her eyes were wild with terror. "Please," she gasped. "Please." Greta grabbed her arm and hauled her inside, slammed the door, dropped the bar. In the sudden darkness, Agnes collapsed against the wall, still holding Jakob. The boy wasn't moving. What happened? The dugout. Agnes was sobbing, switching between English and Czech. "Water. Everywhere water. I ran. He was hit." She touched her son's head. "He was hit." Greta felt for the boy's chest, found a heartbeat. Weak, but there. His breathing was shallow. A lump the size of an egg was rising on his temple. "He's alive. Please." Agnes couldn't seem to say anything else. "Please, please." Greta pulled them both to the center of the room. 5 children now, 2 women. One of the children wasn't moving. Outside, the hail continued to fall. The longest 11 minutes of Greta Lindqvist's life. She held Jakob Gruber in her lap while Agnes pressed a rag to her own bleeding head. Carl had gathered Elin and Anna in the corner, his small body shielding his sisters, his face pale in the darkness. The cabin shook with every impact, dust raining from the ceiling, the roar so loud that Greta couldn't hear herself think. But the walls held. The roof held. The door, dented but intact, held. In a house with windows, this would have been chaos. Glass exploding inward, ice pouring through the gaps, temperature dropping, everything wet, everyone exposed, no shelter left to shelter in. In Greta's windowless cabin, the storm beat against 30 inches of solid earth and found nothing to exploit. No gaps, no weak points, no glass to shatter. The children were crying. Agnes was praying in Czech. Jakob's breathing was getting stronger, a good sign, Greta thought, though she didn't know enough about head injuries to be sure. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the roar began to fade. The impacts slowed, spaced out, stopped. Silence. Or something like it, the silence of aftermath, of destruction completed, of a world catching its breath. Greta lifted the bar and opened the door. The prairie was white, not snow, ice. Hailstones covered every surface, the ground, the grass, the roof of the cabin. Some were the size of eggs. Some were the size of fists. Some, scattered here and there like fallen meteors, were as large as a man's skull. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees. The rain that followed the hail was already turning to sleet. Greta stepped outside and looked at her cabin. Dents in the sod door, a dozen of them, maybe more, where the largest stones had struck. Dents in the walls, but no holes, no damage. The structure stood exactly as it had before, solid as a small hill, unmarked except for the white layer of ice slowly melting on its surface. She looked toward the Henriksen place, a mile and a half south. Something was wrong with the silhouette. Part of the roof had collapsed. She could see figures moving in the yard. The family had made it to the barn then. She looked toward the Halverson place. She couldn't see damage from this distance, but she knew what she'd find. Broken windows, soaked interior. A man who'd told her a house without windows was a grave, now sitting in a house that couldn't keep out the storm. In the doorway behind her, Agnes Gruber appeared, still holding Jakob. The boy was awake now, crying, clutching his mother, alive.
He's all right, Agnes said. I think he's all right. Greta nodded. She couldn't speak. They'd made it. All of them. 2 women and 5 children, sheltering in a cabin that everyone had laughed at, that everyone had pitied, that everyone had said would be her grave. The windowless cabin had held. 3 days later, Einar Halvorsen rode to Greta's claim. He looked older than he had in February, smaller somehow. He dismounted slowly, favoring his left foot, and stood looking at her cabin for a long moment before he spoke. Lost both windows, he said. Spent 2 nights with blankets nailed over the holes. Still got frostbite on 3 toes. Greta didn't say anything.
Henriksen roof came down. They're living in the barn until Anders can rebuild. Lost half their food stores to water damage. He took off his hat, held it in both hands like a man at a funeral. I told you this house was a grave. I told you those children would go blind. I told you. He stopped, shook his head. I've been building Saudis for 12 years, never built one without windows. Never occurred to me that the windows were the weak point. He looked at her directly for the first time. I was wrong. The words hung in the air. Greta had imagined this moment, the vindication, the apology, the acknowledgement that she'd been right all along. She'd imagined it would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt like exhaustion. Would you show me? Halvorsen asked. How you sealed the door. The technique. Greta showed him. She showed him the clay and grass mixture Anders had taught her. She showed him how the walls were laid to avoid vertical seams. She showed him the roof structure that had absorbed the hail without cracking. He listened. He asked questions. He took notes on a scrap of paper. When he left, he pressed a silver dollar into her hand. For the lesson, he said, and for being right when I was wrong. It was the most expensive lesson Greta had ever given. Over the following weeks, the visitors came, Anders Henriksen studying her roof construction for the rebuild. 3 farmers from the south end of the county wanting to see the cabin that survived. A land office clerk from Geneva verifying that her dwelling met homestead requirements. A journalist from the Shickley newspaper writing about storm damage in the region. Each one left with the same observation. The solid walls worked. The absence of glass wasn't poverty, it was protection. Marta Henriksen came with eggs and a confession. I told you the darkness would drive you mad, she said. Your children look healthier than mine. The darkness was hard. I know, I can't imagine. Marta set down her basket. Anders is talking about rebuilding without windows. I told him he was crazy. Then I remembered what I told you. She paused. Maybe I don't know as much about building as I thought. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was close. Thomas Lund came in late May. He rode up to Greta's claim on a horse that cost more than her entire homestead, wearing a coat that had never seen a day's work. His smile was the same as before, tight, calculated, never reaching his eyes. Mrs. Lindqvist, he said, I see you weathered the storm. I did. Remarkable. He looked at her walls, her roof, her unmarked door. Truly remarkable. The whole county took damage except you. And you, Greta said. I heard your store lost its windows. The smile flickered. A temporary setback. I've already ordered replacements from Omaha. Have you? I have. He dismounted, though Greta hadn't invited him to stay. I also heard you have had visitors, people asking about your construction method. They have questions. I answer them. For free? For free. Lund's jaw tightened. That's generous of you. Perhaps too generous. Some people might think you could charge for that kind of knowledge.
Some people charge for everything. Greta met his eyes. I'm not some people. They stood there for a moment, the merchant who sold glass and the widow who'd refused to buy it. Lund had predicted her failure. He'd wanted her failure. Her success meant something he couldn't control, couldn't profit from, couldn't add to his ledger. I suppose some people don't care about living properly, he said finally. They just care about living. I suppose they do. He mounted his horse, looked down at her one last time. Good luck with your harvest, Mrs. Lindqvist. I hope you won't need my credit come fall. He rode away. Greta watched him go and felt nothing. She'd already won the only fight that mattered. Within 2 years, 7 families in Fillmore County had built windowless cabins. 3 were new arrivals, too poor to afford glass, following the Lindqvist method because it was all they could manage. 4 were established settlers who'd lost their windows in the May storm and decided not to replace them. They cited the Swedish widow's example. They cited her survival. They cited the simple logic of not putting holes in walls you needed to hold. Greta shared what she knew freely. She didn't charge for advice. She didn't claim to have invented anything. She'd built walls without glass because she couldn't afford glass. The fact that those walls had saved her life was luck or providence or something in between. Build the walls thick, she told anyone who asked. Build the door tight. Don't put holes in your house that you don't need. The technique spread no further than the county. It was too simple, too contrary to what respectable settlers believed. People wanted light. People wanted windows. People wanted to see who was coming. But for those who adopted it, it worked. Greta Lindqvist proved up her claim in September 1888, 5 years to the day after she filed. She never remarried. Einar Halvorsen proposed twice, once in 1886 and again in 1889, and she declined both times, not unkindly. She liked him better after he admitted he was wrong, but she didn't need a husband. She had her land. She had her children. She had walls that had held when nothing else would. Carl grew up to be a carpenter, like his father. He built houses across Fillmore County for 30 years, and every one of them had windows, small ones, deeply recessed with heavy shutters that could seal against storms. The Lindqvist style, people called it, though the windows were his addition, not his mother's. Elin married a farmer from Adams County and had 4 children of her own. Anna, the sickly baby who coughed through that first terrible winter, became a school teacher. She taught in a one-room schoolhouse with 2 windows and told her students about the cabin where she'd grown up. It was dark, she'd say, but we were warm, and we were alive. Greta lived in the windowless cabin until 1897, when Carl built her a frame house with 4 glass windows on the same property. She kept the old cabin standing as a root cellar and storm shelter. She never slept in the new house during thunderstorms. She died in October 1912, age 58. They buried her on the homestead, beside the cabin she'd built with bleeding hands 29 years before. The sod walls were still standing. They're gone now. Time and weather and neglect have returned them to the prairie they came from. But for one winter and one spring and one terrible May afternoon, they held. On May 3rd, 1884, hailstones the size of a man's fist fell on Fillmore County for 11 minutes. Every window in the settlement shattered. Every frame house took damage. The respectable homes, the homes with glass, with light, with what civilization demanded, became sieves for the storm. The sky fell in frozen chunks, and everything built to be admired failed, and everything built to survive endured. Einar Halvorsen, who had survived 11 Nebraska winters and helped build 14 sod houses across the county, told Greta Lindqvist on the day she arrived,
A house without windows is a grave with a door. Those children will go blind living in darkness, and when the fever comes, you'll watch them die in a hole you dug yourself. He was wrong. The house without windows was the only one still standing when the hammering stopped. The woman he expected to bury come spring outlived him by 6 years. The children he pitied grew up healthy in the darkness he said would destroy them. The last light of that May evening came through Greta's open door. It fell on 3 children asleep in the corner, exhausted from fear, safe because their mother had been too poor to build the house everyone told her to build. It fell on an injured boy recovering in her bed. It fell on walls that had taken every blow the sky could throw and given back nothing. She had $9, 3 children, and a cabin with no windows. The neighbors had laughed. They weren't laughing anymore.